We have an important moment right now to advance dialogue and action surrounding racial equity around the world. That starts within each of us as individuals, and it starts at places like Google. Google's values are based on three respects. First, we respect all of our users because a problem is never solved if it's only solved for some. Second, we respect the opportunity. Working at Google comes with the responsibility to do the right thing and to accomplish things that matter. And third, we respect each other. We co-create a culture where everyone belongs. These values are the foundation for our concrete commitments to racial equity, building sustainable equity within Google, building products that, for example, help Black users, investing in economic opportunities for Black business owners and entrepreneurs, closing gaps in STEM education, supporting racial justice organizations, and more. This series is a forum to empower all of us to do even more. We'll explore topics and issues surrounding racial equity in its many forms with some of the world's leading voices in this space. Our goal is to amplify those voices and come together as a global community to make real change. Thank you for joining us as we search for racial equity.
Welcome to the next episode of the Talks at Google Search for Racial Equity series. My name is Cherise Torres, and I am the Global Director of Inclusion at Google, and I am thrilled to be in conversation today with Professor Ibram X. Kendi. Professor Kendi is one of America's foremost historians and leading anti-racist voices. He's a National Book Award winning and #1 New York Times bestselling author, the Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities and founding director of the Boston University Center for Anti-Racist Research, a contributing writer at The Atlantic, and a CBS News correspondent. And in this fall, Professor Kendi will become the Francis B. Cashin Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for the Advanced Study at Harvard University. Professor Kendi is the author of The Black Campus Movement, which won the W.E.B. Du Bois Book Prize, and Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, which won the National Book Award for Nonfiction in 2016. His third book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, was a #1 New York Times bestseller and made several best books of 2019 lists. His much anticipated fourth book with Jason Reynolds, Stamped, Racism, Anti-Racism and You, was a #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, and his first board book, Anti-Racist Baby, was published just last month and was a #1 indie bestseller. Professor Kendi, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm excited to be in conversation with you.
Absolutely. So let's just jump right in. In your book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, you use your personal experiences to introduce readers to anti-racism. Can you please tell us a bit of your story and how it led to the work that you do today?
Sure. So, I came of age in the 1990s, and if there was really ever a period when Black youth were considered the problem, were considered a menace to society, were considered the American racial problem, were considered super predators, it was the 1990s. And so, as a Black youngster, I was constantly told that there was something wrong with Black young people. And eventually I started consuming and internalizing those ideas. And eventually I started believing that there was something wrong with Black people. And so really my journey is a journey from overcoming those anti-Black racist ideas to ultimately realizing there's nothing wrong with Black people, and there's everything wrong with the racist policies that are ensnaring Black people. And so that journey has really been a journey to be anti-racist, a journey to realize that the problem is power and policy and not people. And I sort of share that journey, in How to Be an Anti-Racist.
Fantastic. So for those who have not yet read your book, can you please explain the difference between not being racist and actually being anti-racist?
Sure. So typically people say, I am not racist when someone challenges something that they said or did as being racist. And by contrast, to be anti-racist is to have the willingness to admit and acknowledge and even recognize the times in which we as individuals are being racist, and certainly the ways in which our society is racist. And so for me, the heartbeat of racism is denial. And the sound of that denial is, I'm not racist. While the heartbeat of anti-racism is confession and the ability to say, yes, indeed, I was being racist. Yes, indeed, I'm going to transform myself to be anti-racist. Yes, indeed, that idea that there's something wrong with Latinx people or Native people is a racist idea. Yes, indeed, those policies leading to Black people disproportionately dying of police violence are racist policies. And I'm going to stop saying those ideas and supporting those policies. And instead, I'm going to support ideas that say there's nothing wrong with any racial group and they're equals. And I'm going to support policies that reduce inequity and injustice.
That's really powerful and an important difference, right? Because I feel like so many times what we hear when we're trying to call in others or make them aware of the problematic nature of some of their comments, the knee-jerk reaction is, but I'm not a racist. Mm-hmm. So to really have that language, I think is really important for everyone as we dig deeper into issues of racial equity.
Yeah. I think so. And I think it is critically important for people to also recognize that racist and anti-racist are descriptive terms, meaning they describe what a person is being in any given moment as opposed to who a person is. And the reason why that's critical is because most Americans seemingly hold both racist and anti-racist ideas, depending on their racial group, depending on the subject, depending on the sector. And so if you're an American who believes that there's something wrong with Latinx people, but you don't necessarily believe there's something wrong with Native people, when you're saying there's something wrong with Latinx people, you're being racist. When you're saying there's nothing wrong with Native people, and there's everything wrong with the policies, the racist policies that are harming Native people, you're being anti-racist. And we have to recognize the complexity of humans, and we have to recognize that people have the capacity to change. And we have to recognize that when we are expressing racist ideas, we're being racist. But in the very next moment, we can confess and recognize and change those ideas and be anti-racist.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I feel like it reminds me of Brene Brown. And I know you recently did a podcast with her on her Unlocking Us podcast, where she talks about the difference between guilt and shame. And guilt is related to something I've done. Shame is related to who I am. And the way you describe this, anti-racism or racist behavior is related to something you've done, an approach you've espoused, rather than who you are. We can change our behavior to be anti-racist.
Exactly. And being anti-racist and even the term anti-racist, like the term racist, these are verbs. This is about what you're doing. This is about what you're being. This isn't this isn't about what's in someone's bones or what's in someone's heart. This is what's in someone's words and what's in someone's actions.
That's incredible. So moving into having these conversations. So at Google, we center everything that we do in our values, or something we call the 3 respects. Respect the user, respect the opportunity, and respect each other. And as you've alluded to in this conversation, respect is really critically important in conversations about race. And oftentimes, these conversations can be impeded because they make people uncomfortable. These aren't easy things to talk about. So as someone whose work is centered around race, what would you say about how we can find ways to navigate that discomfort?
Sure. So my wife, Sadiqa, is a pediatric ER doctor. And so, in other words, she works in the emergency room of a children's hospital. In other words, parents who are scared to death bring their children because they think there's something could be wrong with them. And it is on her to indeed tell them to indeed diagnose that child, knowing that it's going to hurt the child, knowing that it's going to hurt the parents to hear that the child has some sort of difficult illness or that something is seriously wrong. And physicians, particularly peds ER docs, are taught to be extremely direct and open with the parent, to not beat around the bush, to tell the parent exactly what's going on with their child, knowing that obviously it's going to hurt.
Yes.
But when that parent, or even like when I was sort of diagnosed with cancer, I didn't think someone was telling me I had cancer because they were trying to hurt me. I thought that they were diagnosing me because they wanted to help me. And so I think it's critically important for people to recognize, especially when people who are skilled and who study and are experts, and it's their expertise to understand and diagnose racism, that when they're diagnosed with being racist, that the effort is to help them. And they should respond in the same way that they respond when they are diagnosed with a serious illness, which is, you know what? You're trying to help me. It hurts like hell for you to tell me that, but I know you're trying to help me. And I know the next thing we need to talk about is treatment.
Yeah. I've heard you in other interviews say it's like growing up in a racist society, or a society with racist tendency, is like being caught in a rainstorm and someone suddenly brings you an umbrella and tells you, here, take this so that you don't continue to get wet. And not only did you not realize you were wet because it's all you've ever known, sometimes you can question even taking the help because it changes the norm that you've always known. I don't think I'm explaining this quite as eloquently as you have.
No, I mean, I think you explained it very well. I mean, it's, I guess to add to that, it's the rain itself, or the sort of the rain of racist ideas have taught you to believe that you're dry. And so when somebody then comes and brings you an umbrella, you don't think there's any problem because you've been taught to look out at this society and to believe that your racist ideas about what's wrong with a particular racial group are based in science, are based in logic, are the norm, or truth, or reality. And then to thereby deny that those ideas are indeed racist. And so I think that that's really what it is for you know, I'm trying to get people to realize that racist ideas are raining on their head and they're wet and they're tripping and falling. And more importantly, they're tripping and hitting other people.
Yeah. So you've written at length, speaking of which, tripping and falling while they're getting wet and they still think that they're dry. You've written at length about how some people are in denial and unable to see either their own racist behavior or the racist policies that create inequity. You've written, denial is the heartbeat of racism. Why is denial so prevalent and enduring? And how does this denial contribute to the status quo?
So when during the transatlantic slave trade, those who were justifying the slave trade in the highest echelons of Western European society were claiming that the policies were not racist. And indeed, Black people were being civilized by being taken out of these barbaric places and really brought to civilization. During the enslavement era, slaveholders were denying that their policies were racist, that their policies were the problem, and were instead saying that indeed Black people are where God intended them to be. They're the cursed descendants of Ham that's cursed forever into enslavement, or they are where nature intended them to be. They are by nature a servile people. And so therefore my policies are not racist, or that, I'm following US law. And then of course Jim Crow emerged, and Jim Crow segregationists were saying that, everything is perfectly separate but equal down here. We're following the law. There's no there's no racism here. We are separate but equal. There's no problem. And if anything, those civil rights outside agitators are creating a problem between the races who are certainly getting along. And that lynching, there's nothing wrong with lynching, and everything wrong with the people who are being lynched for what they're doing. And then, that has continued right to this day, in which every policy is justified as being not racist, and every idea is justified as being not racist. And so if we can't even identify policies as racist, then that's essentially like someone having an illness and refusing to identify that they're sick. How will they ever be able to get better?
Going back to your point around racist policy and the impact of that, maybe even unintended consequences at times, but the impact of policy to create inequity. I know that you've worked extensively looking at racial disparities in COVID, both from diagnosis, morbidity or death rates, and the shift in how the conversation went around the impact of COVID-19 on the Black community. Can you talk a bit about that and how the definition of, or almost blaming the victim, if you will, came into play related to race?
Sure. So in mid-March, Pew Research Center did a survey of Americans, and they found that Black Americans were twice as likely than, were actually 2 times more likely than white Americans to be taking coronavirus or the coronavirus very, very seriously. We're much more likely, and even Latinx people were much more likely than white people to be, for instance, buying perishables so that they can socially distance. At the same time, Americans were saying that COVID-19 was the great equalizer, because in mid-March, there was no racial data. By mid-April, it was a national story that there were racial disparities, that Black people were dying at disproportionate rates. And by mid-April, you had people saying, well, Black people are dying at disproportionate rates because they're not taking the coronavirus as seriously as white people. They're not socially distancing as much as white people. They're basically irresponsible yet again with their health. Studies had already proven that that was not the case, right? And it really took for white people demonstrating all over this country to reopen states for people to realize that actually Black people were not the ones who were not taking this virus seriously. So there must be something else. And so then it switched to, well, Black people are dying at disproportionate rates because Black people have more pre-existing conditions. And then either people left it at that, or they then said that Black people have more pre-existing conditions because they don't take care of themselves. They don't value their health. They eat that garbage soul food as if, white people don't gather together and eat hamburgers and hot dogs. Americans in general don't eat well, no matter their race, right? And so it was this, there's something wrong with Black people and their culture and the way they live and the way they are, that's leading to their pre-existing conditions and their behavior. And so then Black people started hearing lectures about how they need to sort of take more seriously their health so they have less pre-existing conditions. All the while, what was even more predictive than pre-existing conditions was employment status. That Black and brown people were less likely to be able to work from home. That was then leading to them being infected and obviously killed at higher rates. All the while, another thing that was more predictive than pre-existing conditions was Black people having less access to both medical insurance and high quality care, which was causing them to present with more advanced stages of COVID-19, which then, anybody who prevents, no matter the race, of any disease, they're less likely to, of course, survive it. That Black people, another greater predictor of Black disproportionate infection and death rates was the air and water quality of one's neighborhoods, which obviously was not only leading to pre-existing conditions, but also in places like Detroit, where residents were told, okay, you need to wash your hands. Well, what if I don't have running water? Or what if I don't feel comfortable in Flint, Michigan, washing my hands, right? And so, all the while it was racist policies that was behind these disparities. But still to this day, it seems like most Americans are just simply chalking it up to either Black irresponsibility or pre-existing conditions.
I think a similar trend and data-based racial disparity, you talk about the importance of data in analyzing policies and disparity, is conversations that are had around crime rates and the generalizations that are made around Black neighborhoods or predominantly Black neighborhoods and high crime rates. Can you talk a bit about that connection?
Sure. So, one of the most dangerous racist ideas is the idea of the dangerous Black neighborhood with those dangerous Black people. And obviously we can understand how and why that's so dangerous, because if police officers are raised in America where they're taught, like the rest of us, to believe that Black people are more dangerous, that even when Black people are unarmed, they're armed through their Blackness, then obviously we know the effects of that. But what people don't understand is people just assume, and if people have been taught to believe that that neighborhoods with higher levels of violent crime, that have a larger number of Black people have been led to believe that it's the Blackness of the people that is leading to that violent crime. And if that was indeed the case, then Black upper income neighborhoods would have the same levels of violent crime as the most impoverished Black neighborhoods, but they don't. And so I don't understand how people assess that it's the Blackness of the people that is behind the levels of violent crime, when if that was again the case, then all Black neighborhoods, no matter the levels of poverty, no matter the levels of unemployment, no matter the wealth, would have the same levels of violent crime. And so what that means is actually what we should be seeing is dangerous unemployed neighborhoods, dangerous impoverished neighborhoods, which then changes the calculation. Because then we're not going to say, oh, we need police in order to handle that crime. What we're going to say is we need jobs, we need resources, we need higher paying jobs. And those things can fight violent crime better than any police officer.
I want to dig a little deeper into your work around racial data. And you always say that racial data plays a critical role when it comes to identifying disparities. But as you've mentioned in a few of your examples here, racial data also has a long history of being used to claim Black people are inferior and blaming them for their circumstances. How can we make sure that racial data is not used to stigmatize people? And not just for Black people, as you mentioned, this is Latinx communities, this is Native American communities, the difference between a race-based challenge and an income or poverty-based challenge. How do we make sure that data is not being used to further stigmatize?
So first, I think it's critically important for us to just stand on the anti-racist position that if there's a racial disparity that's shown via racial data, then there must be something wrong with policy as opposed to people. And so then our job, when the data shows that disparity, is to figure out what policies are causing this disparity, and to not start to think, okay, what's wrong with those Latinx or Black people? If we can just take the position that has been proven over 600 years, people have been trying to prove that there's something inferior about people of color, and still that has yet to be proven. But if we take the position that there's nothing wrong with any racial group, then we can then use that data for how we should be using it. It's a window into a policy problem that we need to investigate. But I also think that we then have racial disparities, and then people make the case, okay, there must be an economic factor to that racial disparity. And because Americans don't want to confront racism. And the issue is that this is very simple. If you have a economic inequality, then there's a racial fact, I'm sure say there's an economic factor or policies behind that economic inequality. If you have a gender inequity, then there are gender-based policies behind those gender inequities. If you have a racial disparity, then there are racist policies, racial policies behind that inequity. Now, if you're talking about disparities between white elites and the Black poor, then it's probably a combination or an intersection of both economic and racial policies. If you're talking about disparities between white men and Black women, then you're talking about the intersection of racist and sexist policies. This does not have to be that difficult, but oftentimes we make it because we don't want to see the way in which racist policies or their intersection are leading to these disparities.
Now, policy seems to be at the core, or clearly is the core, of a lot of your theory and your approach in talking about anti-racism and the impact of racial inequity due to policy. A lot of times when people in general talk about policy, they connect it back to politics with a big P or a small p. And they make an assumption that this is a conservative issue or this is a liberal issue. But I've heard you speak very clearly that this has nothing to do with conservatives or liberals. Policy can cut both ways. Talk to us a bit about that.
So I remember giving a talk, where was I? I think I was in Gainesville, Florida. And, during the Q&A, a woman who didn't identify herself as a conservative, but she basically stated that, she has a serious problem that this university campus does not allow conservative thinkers to sort of come, and instead they provide platforms for these liberal thinkers to come and critique conservatives. And she indicated and insinuated that I was one of those people. And so my response to her was, well, did you read my book? Because the book was possibly even more critical of liberal thought and liberal thinkers, and certainly policies, than those who are sort of conservative. And it really, and even, so it not only critiqued conservative thought and liberal thought, but even progressive thought and radical thinkers that, and so for me, it's not, there's a form of liberal racism, like there's a form of conservative racism. And you have liberals who make the case, well, only the conservatives are racist, just as you have conservatives who believe only those liberals are racist, when indeed they're both in certain ways being racist.
Yeah. So right now, racial justice is top of mind for many people in America and around the world. How can we seize the present moment and translate it into longer term impact?
So about 3 out of 4 Americans in June were polled as saying racism is a big problem. And so the way in which we ensure that this translates into long-term change is 3 out of 4 Americans also agree on the big solutions that are being proposed to those big problems. And I'm already seeing resistance to some of those big solutions among people who claim racism is a big problem. And so I that is the next step. Certainly it's a critically important step for Americans to no longer be in denial about their own racism, I should say, or the racism of this country. But then they cannot create a new normal of denial, a new normal of denial in which now I'm going to essentially deny that those big sort of solutions are the solvent.
So we know that systemic changes are needed to address racism in America and around the globe. How can individuals help to maintain the momentum we have around the search for racial equity?
I think it's critically important for individuals to realize their own power. Right? Individuals have shown that they have the power to demonstrate in the smallest of towns to the largest of cities in the United States and really around the world. But individuals also have the power to join and fund and volunteer at organizations in their local communities, in their states, in the nation that is directly challenging racism. They have the power to compel their elected officials to support more radical policy changes that have the capacity to eliminate inequity in a given field overnight in the next year. And we all have that power. And I want people to recognize their power and even recognize their expertise and even recognize what they have to give to this larger struggle and certainly give that to this movement.
Going back to the role of individuals, so often people say, I'm not equipped to have these conversations. Can you give me a top 10 list of what I need to know to be an anti-racist? And any of us who are in this work know that there are no shortcuts here, but everyone is on and responsible for their individualized learning journey on this path. What would you say to those who claim, I just don't know enough? Can you give me a shortcut here?
It's a journey. And so there isn't really a shortcut. There isn't really even a destination, because I think it's critically important for people to almost recognize that to be raised in the United States is to be raised to be racist. And to be raised to be racist is to be raised to almost be addicted to racist ideas. And then at some point, you're going to recognize your addiction. It's going to take some time. Obviously, if anyone's addicted to a substance, everyone's telling them they're addicted to that substance, but it takes them a long time to realize that. And then what happens after we recognize we're addicted to that substance? We can't just say, oh, addiction's over. No, it's a daily process. For anyone who is still dealing with an addiction, it's a daily process of self-reflection, of self-control, of transformation. And it's the same thing when it comes to being anti-racist.
Speaking of a daily journey and a lifetime journey, your most recent book, Anti-Racist Baby, starts from the literal cradle, giving parents tools to help raise anti-racist children. And you also worked, I think earlier this year, to make a young adult version of one of your first books, Stamped, for the teenage and young adult audience. Walk us through your thoughts on why it's so important to start young talking about anti-racism and continue those conversations through each stage.
Because the youngest of people are not colorblind. I mean, it's between 3 and 6 months. Our toddlers are beginning to understand race and see race. By 2 years old, our little ones are consuming racist ideas and determining who to play with based on skin colors. And so if we're just imagining that they're colorblind, right, then we're not protecting them with racist ideas. We're not getting them to see, okay, no, you shouldn't say that you really want to play with the lighter kid and not the darker kid. You should recognize, the rainbow that is humanity and all of its sort of beauty. And often, even in middle school and high school, you have young people who are experiencing racism and don't even completely understand it, right? And so as a result of that, they're typically internalizing the messaging, and it's typically harmful for their own sense of self, or they're becoming conceited, and cocky, thinking that, because white people have more, they are more. And so because they are white, they are more, right? And so then they grow to believe that, and just as you have children of color who start to think that there's something wrong with them. And I think it's critically important for us to train our children that there's nothing wrong with you or right about you because of the color of your skin. And I think if the earlier we can teach our kids and ingrain our kids with those perspectives, I think the better.
You said another phrase in that answer that we often hear in response to calling in or calling out folks for a racist comment or racist behavior, that I don't see color. What is the problem with that phrase? Is there a problem with that phrase?
So I think that it is important for people to realize that the solution to eliminating racism is not stopping people from identifying racially. Because what happens is, if we, quote, don't see color, if we don't identify by race, if you don't see and understand racial differences and even identities, then what's going to happen is we're not going to be able to collect racial data, right? Because nobody's identifying by race. We're certainly not identifying by race. When we check into the hospital with COVID-19, we're certainly not going to identify by race when, or the coroner is not going to identify our race when we presumably die of COVID-19. And so then what's going to happen? We're not going to be able to see the racial disparities. And then if we can't see the racial disparities, how can we even begin to see the racist policies? And so then we're going to have racial disparities all around us that we can't even see, let alone the causes of those disparities. And so what's going to happen to those disparities and the policy causes? They're going to continue. And really, that is the final solution. The final solution is having a world of racial inequity that's harming a certain group of people that nobody can even see, let alone challenge. And so really, the idea of no longer identifying by race is presumably the final step, not the first step in creating an anti-racist world.
So as we wrap our conversation today, Professor Kendi, what's your final word for our audience?
I think the final word is that, we're living in a critical time, in American history. And forevermore, people are going to write about these last few months as a time in which we had an unprecedented amount of demonstrations against racism. But then what are they going to write for the next chapter? Are they going to write that then those demonstrations propelled us as a community and as a nation into eliminating racism, racist policies sort of once and for all, and building towards equity and justice? Or, will we essentially let down future generations? And basically they'll write that we just demonstrated, we said racism was a big problem, and then we just said it was too big of a problem to solve. And then we passed on this problem to another generation, passed on the misery and harm and inequity and injustice to another generation. And then they're going to look back at us and say that we were in a moment in which we could have transformed things and we didn't seize that moment. And I don't want future generations to say that about us. I want us to be the generation, I want us to be the people that ultimately transforms this country.
Well, and what a final word that is. So thank you so much for your time today, Professor Kendi. Thank you for all of your work, and thank you to your commitment for helping to build the anti-racism muscle in all of us.
Thank you.
I'm Melanie Parker. Thank you for joining us for the search for racial equity.
Let us march on till victory is won.